Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Professor McGuigan, and I work as the Director of Equity, Diversity and Social Inclusion for the Monash Business School here in Melbourne. I would very much like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional custodians of the land upon which I am recording this presentation for you today. I extend and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future, and I acknowledge their deep understanding of diversity and inclusion through their powerful connection to community. I am so sorry that I'm unable to join you in person today, and I hope that there will be a way in which we can connect in the future. I'm incredibly grateful to Katrina, Justine, and Madeline for extending this invitation, and so pleased to be able to join you at this TEXA conference to illustrate unique ways of fostering safe student community cultures for LGBTQIA+ students in higher education. So if we think about queer identities in education, 1 in 6 young adults identify across that broad spectrum of the LGBTQIA+ community. Often that is not a visible or physical characteristic, and so it remains hidden. We see a lack of representation of queer identity across the higher education sector. And we need to start to think about how that can shift. We need to encourage visibility. We need to encourage awareness and think about that from an education point of view. So if we start to adopt an intersectional lens and we start to look at different characteristics that people might occupy, might exhibit, we have multiple characteristics. Humans are very complex. And so our sexuality, LGBTQIA+, and how we identify is one characteristic amongst many. And so we see that this complexity becomes an interesting dilemma that we need to start to think about and start to think about addressing, because essentially this is a little bit how we educate. We educate within a mass education environment where people receive a very standard approach to education. It's standardized. People get the same type of product, if you think. And this is particularly true, of course, from a business school perspective, which is clearly where I'm coming from. So this idea of a standardized education, we educate within a mass environment. How can we start to think about the unique experiences, the unique individual, and try to provide these unique experiences within this mass higher education environment? And that question is going to become increasingly important into our futures. If we think about queer identities in higher education, our inclusion strategies absolutely enhance visibility, they enhance awareness, and those two things are really important, but they don't always address the normative structures in which we operate. And those normative structures that might be preventing safe spaces for the queer community, for the LGBTQIA+ community within higher education. And that becomes really important from a university perspective, where we start to think about the types of visual cues that the university can be providing at that broad overarching level, where we start to think about the types of ally networks that are being created, where peers and peers can start to support each other, students on students, as well as peer mentors from a staff perspective, joining allies and raising that level of awareness and education. Starting to think about the types of senior leadership that become champions for LGBTQIA+ inclusion, diversity, and awareness. The types of events that we might offer across the university and also within faculties and disciplines, so that we start to see broad representation. We start to see broad events and activities that students can become part of, that they can engage with, clubs, societies, etc. Starting to think about how we might benchmark ourselves with the Australian Workplace Equality Index, for example, becoming members of Pride and Diversity and rolling out some of those strategies across the higher education sector. Secondly, we start to think about the types of education we offer, both from an informal perspective and an informal perspective. The training that we can offer our ally networks, transgender awareness, for example, Queer 101, starting to really think about raising that awareness within the university and how that can be quite successful. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention there from a university perspective, Monash decided that it would go slightly further, and we wanted to be the gold sponsorship for the new Victorian Pride Centre's launch of a LGBTQIA plus leadership program called Pride in Action, where the Victorian community start to come together around LGBTQIA plus leadership from non-profit, profit, and other public-based institutions to start to really think about how we can develop leadership skills and abilities within our queer communities. So this leadership program becomes a 12-month program designed to deliver positive impact for the LGBTQIA plus community and for participant careers, to try to foster a network of LGBTQIA plus leaders for support and collaboration, and stimulate learning and foster cross-organizational collaboration. And we knew we had to be a big part of that. We had to be able to try to support that and try to grow leadership, both within the institution, but equally into the public and community environments as well. What I was hoping to think about is this idea of shifting cultures by exploring informal educational spaces. What does diversity feel like in business schools? And I wanted to take the opportunity to utilize a context of a business, of the business school, to be able to illustrate how we've started to try to think about exploring some of those more informal educational spaces that we have across institutions, across higher education. And I think part of the reason we wanted to start to explore informal spaces to create that level of visualization, visibility within the environment, but also to try to think about how we could rub up against some of those normative structures and start to think about this from a duality perspective, that we can hold two ideas in one's mind at the same time, two ways of doing things, multiple ways of doing things, and trying to think about this from a diversity and intersectionality lens. And why those informal spaces? Because they're dynamic, they're fluid, they're free, often, they're creative, they're non-structured or hierarchical, which is particularly important within a business context, that not all identities fit within. That often those informal spaces can be very interdisciplinary, where people come together organically to talk, to learn, to discover, to engage, to connect. And often what is probably quite an advantage of those spaces is they're not owned. They're not formally owned by a center, by a department, by a faculty. They're often fluid and dynamic, and they come together and they're transitionary in their nature. But they're also public and they're also private spaces. And it enables that kind of creative experimentation where we can start to explore. So I wanted to utilize an example where we've started to think about queering business from different perspectives, and what that might look like, and how we can start to really create that level of visibility within what is quite a conservative and structured environment. Marriage equality was a huge success in terms of 5 years ago when we were able to get marriage equality, that Australia did decide to vote in the right direction. However, that was a very difficult period of time for many who were living through what was happening in Australia at that time, where our, I guess, human rights, or our rights to be able to marry the ones we love, were being debated publicly. The conversation was quite public, and it was quite damning, and it was quite a struggle to live through. And so part of this was trying to embrace this space that was happening in 2018, and try to really think about what we can be doing differently, how we can open that up, and how we can push back and activize against quite conservative operations sometimes within business. And so what we wanted to do as a group is we started to think about how we could create these different cultures. We could open this up more broadly. And we went to an organization called Front Yard Projects, and we created an art project, which was trying to think about business and art and how they might come together. So it was already quite a transdisciplinary space, but adding that queer lens on enabled us to really start to experiment and innovate in that kind of space. And we were engaged with our staff, with our students, but also with industry bringing those groups together to have these kind of conversations and utilizing social media to try to create a much broader visibility than we could have ever started to imagine before that point. And so we created this kind of brand around queering accounting, which was one example of this project. And you can see on the left-hand side there, this idea of the structure of that artist space. You can see with that artist space that it was in a suburban environment. We were taking over that suburban environment, really thinking about how we could take the business school out into the public and engage the public in that process. And you can see there that level of visibility with the window pane, where we were really starting to think about having those conversations from a research and an education perspective, utilizing the physical spaces in really transparent ways. So people could watch, they could walk past, they could watch, they could observe, they could engage, and they could interact over time. We started to do that also by creating films, by filming some of those environments. We did them in creative ways. We had a brunch where we brought together LGBTQIA plus students, staff, as well as industry members to start to have conversations around how we could queer business, how we could queer the accounting profession, and what that might look like. So really starting to have these kind of interesting, visible conversations that would be organic and create some really interesting discussions and artifacts and materials, which you can start to see here in terms of the exploration with some of these images. We were really starting to brainstorm and have some fun in these spaces, and really try to visualize these within the university. So we did this in a public space, and then we brought it back into the business school through social media, through engagement, so that students were able to see that the kind of explorations, the spaces that we were starting to play with. We collected some of the data and created this Manifesto Project. And I mentioned that because during the pandemic, we were able to publish this in a creative art space in North America. And then we ended up taking that as a provocation to England, to take that to queer business in the International Financial Reporting Standards, which were housed in Canary Wharf. We started to then create an archive space where we were giving these resources back into the archive. And of course, this was always documented through our social media, through engagement, so that our students were able to follow some of these activities and feel like they were part of, or they could see that level of visibility within a very, I guess, profession or conservative space that this had not ever been done before. And so we started to be able to connect our students with other students right across within that professional or business context. We also worked with drag artist, performance artist, Karen from finance, and this gave it a completely different, I guess, reach that we would never have been able to have if it wasn't for Karen. So when Karen was on RuPaul's Drag Race, there really was that level of public engagement with what they were working with us on. And so Karen was able to do some activities with us, and we'll talk about those throughout the presentation. We also started to think about what spaces look like within the business school and how that can be organic in nature. And so we started to think about holding events, both panel discussions that would discuss aspects of what queering business could look like, how we bring that into curricular design, how we bring that into our industry, what it means to participate and to be part of and belong as an LGBTQIA identifying individual within businesses. And so what businesses were doing, we tried to bring in guest speakers to students so that they could start to network, they could engage, but they were networking, engaging within this space, which hadn't really been done within a business environment before. So it wasn't just business networking, it was business networking within a group and community to create safe spaces and safe communities for our students and our staff accordingly. So what was really interesting is we started to have fun with that environment. We brought in film nights, we brought in panel discussions, we brought in candy floss and popcorn and tried to make that a really enjoyable and queer creative space. The other thing we started to think about was what Instagram could do for us, both in terms of amplifying some of the visibility across the school, to create those sense of awareness in what the business school was involved in and engaged in, to think about that from a inclusive perspective for our LGBTQIA identifying staff and students. But it was also about taking that Instagram type approach and thinking about how we could bring that physically into the business school. And so what we started to think about was during Diversity and Inclusion Week, we created this art installation where we Instagrammed queer business, and we started to bring these images into the business school. So what you can see here is quite a physically visible space within the school, right on the ground floor reception, that people, staff and students, as well as visitors, were able to walk past. We had these posters created, like the Karen from Finance list of things to do, as well as the business-based Instagram suit that you saw before. And we started to put these images visibly right across the reception areas of the school, as well as key spaces like coffee and student community group hanging out kind of spaces that the business school had. And so the idea was to enhance visibility, but we also made it interactive and engaging. So we started to have an opportunity for students to be able to send in their images, and they were able to tag those images, and then we were able to link them to the Instagram account that we were operating as well. The other thing in terms of the way of creating culture and safe spaces is to take some of these aspects into the classroom with us as well. And so what you can see here is the idea of creating a business within a classroom is to create the use of collage to be starting to think about business concepts. So for example, what accounting might look like, and we're able to use these visual collages to try to think about and display. So it's able to give individuals a unique creative approach to their ways of thinking. We also utilize this within performance structures within organizations. What motivates individuals intrinsically or extrinsically? We asked students to be able to utilize Play-Doh to be able to start to create something physically that would be a type of motivating force for them. So what motivates them? They had to actually create that from a Play-Doh perspective, which then started the conversation and the dynamic across the room. So we could see this kind of unique approach that was coming through into the learning, and students were able to not only create something, but they could use that as the stimulus in order to form that discussion. The other thing we engage with is this idea of unboxing videos, which were very popular within students, where they were able to create a solution based with all of this creative play into these play boxes, and then they started to video the solution out by unpacking what was in the box to display that level of solution, which was a really fun way of engaging in quite complex educational spaces. The other thing we did is we partnered with industry to create a type of networking across both our profession as well as our student base and staff, where we brought all those groups in together in the industry spaces as well as within the business school spaces. So it was about bringing industry onto campus within the business school, but it was also taking the business school out into industry to be able to have those conversations with different industry members, so that students were able to see what it would be like to be engaged within the profession and how to interact and engage within that profession. So it was a great opportunity for our students to be learning and being mentored in really unique ways. The other thing is we partnered with Karen from Finance again, and we had a Pride and Diversity business dinner where we did exactly the same thing, but over a dinner, as well as her performance, where she was engaged with industry members, with our students, and with staff together. And so it was trying to create a blurred boundary across those informal spaces within the school. So it was starting to think about how we take the school out into industry, but doing that in really creative spaces. And this example is actually at the Imperial Hotel based in Sydney, where they filmed Priscilla. So it had a really strong, I guess, LGBTQIA activism to it. So it was again starting to think about blurring the boundaries of the heteronormative or the normative structures that we have, and starting to think about how we could play with those in really fluid ways. The other thing we did, of course, is march within Pride marches here in Melbourne. We also went to Auckland in New Zealand to do this with the profession and others throughout the country. And so the idea is that we were together with our students and staff being able to march in those spaces as well. and of course, amplifying that through social media so that we could start to have a real strong presence. And what you can see on the right-hand side there, just above me, is when we marched with CPA Australia as well as Monash together in the Melbourne Pride March, which was a lot of fun. If we think about things that we can be doing to create these safe spaces, it's really basic things around really just thinking about our language and using inclusive language, of course. I like the idea of social bubble hopping because for our allies and for others, it enables ourselves to explore other opportunities, to explore other perspectives so that we can hold multiple perspectives in mind at similar times. And so my colleague in Stockholm talks about social bubble hopping, where you bubble hop into new ways of thinking or new experiences or new communities. So one Saturday you might be going to an AFL match, for example, where you might not be used to engaging in that environment. And so you start to get this perspective. And then the second time you might be rock climbing in the Blue Mountains out of Sydney. And so the idea is you're starting to really test some of your own perspectives, to think outside the box, to think outside yourself, and to be able to bubble hop across different experiences, which may open our minds to broader ways and more diverse ways of thinking. Bringing diverse representation, of course, and visibility is always important. I think we need to be doing much more of that within the education sector in terms of the types of speakers, the types of panels we might operate. Again, we need to start to think about how we can bring some of these aspects into the classroom and operating from a play or creative space as well. Expand traditional disciplinary boundaries, starting to think about where different aspects of business might come together and being able to operate that from a queer lens or a queer perspective, thinking about the type of intersectionality, diversity of curriculums and bringing that idea into practice. And of course, I think a big part of this is modeling behavior. If we want to create safe spaces for our LGBTQIA community in higher education, in universities, we need to do that in a way that's very similar to creating space for everyone, to creating space for diverse voices to be heard. And so much of that comes down to modeling behavior, but equally so much of that is about being human and being able to exhibit human characteristics, human capabilities. And I think what then becomes really important is that idea to promote the use of informal spaces, branch out within those formal curricular design models and formal spaces within universities and start to explore where the informal meets the formal and start to play in those kind of areas, because playing at the edges, playing at the boundaries is what the LGBTQIA community is always been about. It's always been about challenging the norm, challenging the normative structures, because we don't always fit into those normative structures. And so we need to be able to come out as universities to be able to meet somehow in the middle, to be able to start to play in some of those spaces. Encouraging creativity and diversity, opening opportunities and holding spaces for others becomes vital to creating this safe community for all of us. Being able to think in dualities, and I think social bubble hopping definitely helps with that approach. Being vulnerable and being able to learn from others. And I think that includes everyone. When we don't understand or we don't know something, it's about owning this, and it's about being vulnerable, and it's about learning together. And equally, all of those things is a very queer way of thinking. Normalizing risk-taking becomes really important. Obviously, some of those aspects I spoke about from in a business school, which often is traditional, it's often conservative in nature. It is about taking risks. It's about putting ourselves out there. It's about creating that visibility, because that's ultimately what it does when we do go out there and we do create that level of visibility. We end up with inclusion. We end up with diverse approaches, and owning those, and as opposed to the standard way of doing things, becomes such a vital point to create safe spaces for all of us. And as part of that, the world needs more positive activism, possibly now more than ever. It has been an absolute pleasure to be able to engage with you today. And I hope that there has been some aspects of learning that have come from this. And hopefully I would very much like to engage with you in the future. And if you do have questions, please do reach out. I am on LinkedIn at Nick McGuigan, and you can also please do feel free to email me on nicholas.mcguigan@monash.edu. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to hearing from you again soon. Thanks, everyone. Take care.